Alright gang, so we're going to deal with Chapter 8, implementing a high availability server clusters. Now, in this chapter we're going to deal with configuring network load balancing and configure a failover cluster. So, network load balancing. It uses server clusters to provide both scalability and fault tolerance. Server cluster is a group of servers configured to respond to a single virtual IP address. To provide scalability, the servers in a network load balancing cluster share the load of incoming requests based on rules that you can define. To provide fault tolerance, a failed server can be removed from the cluster and another server can take its place. Here we are, here's the cluster, and if you find that 3 are being overloaded, it's easy enough to just add another to the cluster, add another to the cluster, or vice versa. Okay. So installing network load balancing. NLB clusters don't have any special hardware requirements. It's important that each server in the cluster is configured with the same OS version and updates as the others in the cluster. Servers participating in an NLB cluster should not provide services other than the ones that the cluster is providing. Okay. The servers in an NLB cluster should be configured with 2 NICs. An NLB is installed as a feature in Server Manager or using PowerShell. Now you do it using Network Load Balancing Manager in Desktop Experience. Okay. So creating an NLB cluster, it involves the following. Create a new cluster, select a new host and network interface to participate in the cluster, configure the host priority and host ID. You'll set the cluster IP address, set the cluster name and operation mode, and configure port rules. At that point, you'll add servers to the cluster. You have to create the cluster first and then add the servers to them. So here we are, create a new cluster. When creating a new cluster, you have to specify a host to participate in the new cluster. Enter the server name. So here we are here. I'm going to connect to server DM1. Here's our 2 network interface cards. Each participating host is assigned a unique host ID. You're going to have up to 32 servers in a cluster. Choose a priority value of 1 to 32 for each server. Virtual IP address is the address network clients use to access the networking services provided to the cluster. A DNS host record should exist for the cluster name mapped to this IP address. If using a single NIC, the cluster IP address is added to the NIC's TCP/IP properties. A cluster name and operation mode are set in the cluster parameters dialog box. The cluster name is the FQDN that clients use to access the cluster, or full internet name text box. Now, cluster operation mode specifies the type of network addressing used to access the cluster, whether it's unicast, multicast, or IGMP multicast. So here we are with the cluster parameters, IP address, full internet name, and whether using unicast, multicast, or IGMP multicast. All right, we've got port rules specify which type of port, TCP or UDP. Cluster members can be assigned a load weight. The higher the load weight, the more traffic that member handles. Here we go when it comes to port rules. And you can add servers to the cluster using NLB Manager. You just right-click the cluster and then click Add Host to the cluster. Now, the NLB feature must be installed on the server you want to add. You must select the network interface the server will use for communication with clients, and you must assign a priority. After you have at least 2 servers in the cluster, you can further configure the cluster, but it's not until you get 2 in there. So here we are. We're in the NLB Manager, and we've right-clicked. We can add a host. Here's our host configure information for hosts in the cluster. We can delete the cluster properties refresh, or remove from view. Here if we want to control a host or control the ports. Now configuration of an NLB cluster is divided into three categories. There's cluster properties, port rules, and host properties. When it comes to cluster properties, just right-click the cluster name in the NLB manager and click cluster properties. Cluster properties include cluster's IP address and several cluster parameters. And here we go. Here's cluster parameters. We dealt with that already. In most cases, you should change the port rules to accept communication on the cluster address only. Here we are when it comes to defined port rules, whether it's TCP or UDP or both. You got multiple host, affinity. You want none, single, or network, and what the timeout would be, single host, or disable the port range altogether. Okay. Now we've got options for filtering mode, multiple host, or single host. The affinity value, none, single, and network, just indicated those. And here we are to configure host properties for the NLB manager. Here we are in the host properties, and set the priority. It's the IP address. We can add another IP address if we need, and the initial host state, whether it started, or what it may be. Okay. So here we are, add edit port rule. And they're all pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of getting comfortable with how we get to them and what it is they can do for us. So you might need to perform maintenance tasks on a cluster server. You could change the state of a host or the cluster as a whole. The NLB manager control all hosts by right-clicking the cluster, the node itself, and then click control hosts. If you want to control a single host, just right-click that host and click control host. So here we are, and we just saw that before. So I can upgrade an NLB cluster to a new version of Windows Server by taking all cluster hosts offline, upgrade each host individually, bring them back to the cluster. Now, keep in mind, they've all got to be the same roles, same version, same roles. Now, here I'll show you different PowerShell commandlets you can use to configure NLB clusters. We've got the get command for the NLB, and that'll give us a full list of NLB related commandlets. And we've got failover clusters. A failover cluster is deployed for high availability. We've got data and applications are most always available even after the system failure. It's well suited for mission critical applications. Now, things that you may hear when it comes to describing failover clusters. There's clustered application, cluster server, active node, passive node, standby mode, quorum, cluster heartbeat, and witness disk. Now, these are all things that, as you're going through Chapter 8, you're going to just beat yourself up going through them. Go through the flashcards, go through and spend some time in those crosswords to get used to the terminology. Now, a failover cluster consists of 2 or more servers, usually identical configuration, and access to common storage media. Here we are. So we have that redundancy, and we think it's like mirrored setups, isn't it? So a failover cluster works by using 2 or more servers and shared storage to provide fault tolerance and high availability. There are a variety of quorum models. You got node majority quorum, node and disk majority quorum, node and file sharing majority quorum, no majority, disk only quorum, and cloud witness. Now, all cluster servers must have Windows 2016 Standard or Data Center Edition installed. Other hardware and software requirements: identical or nearly identical server components, identical CPU architecture. So as we said, these things need to be the same. Now, cluster applications data must be available to all cluster members. The procedure for installing and creating a failover cluster is generally to install the failover clustering feature on all servers, verify the cluster server network and shared storage access, run the cluster validation wizard, then create the cluster. All right, we could do it through PowerShell, install Windows feature, failover clustering. Okay, so there's a validation wizard for cluster validation. Now, before creating a new cluster, run the Validate a Configuration Wizard in the Failover Cluster Manager. FCM is added to administrative tools after you install the failover clustering feature. In the second window on the wizard, you're prompted to enter names of servers to participate in the cluster. Choose the testing options you want. You should run all the tests when validating a cluster for the first time. And here we are, there's the interface. Here's the validate configuration. Now, during the process of creating a cluster, you're asked to enter a name for the cluster in the access point for administering the cluster window. Enter an IP address. The name and IP address are added to DNS. A new computer object is created in Active Directory with the name of the cluster. The IP address is assigned to the network adapter selected for handling cluster clients. Now, configuring failover clustering. After a cluster is created, the following tasks should be performed: configuring the cluster networks, configuring the quorum model, configuring the cluster storage, and configuring the cluster role. Cluster networks are used they're used for client access, cluster communication, and storage network. Ideally, you should have at least 2 separate networks. 3 would be best. Each network adapter should be connected to a different subnet. So here we are, cluster communication only properties. And configuring the quorum model. In the Failover Cluster Manager, just click the name of the cluster in the left pane. In the Actions pane, click More Actions. Click Configure Cluster Quorum Settings, and then we'll get the Configure Cluster Quorum Wizard. It'll just walk you through it step by step. Now, during the cluster creation, Windows detects shared storage and assigns one of the cluster nodes as the owner. Features and advantages of using CSVs: better backup and restore functions for CSV volumes, support for BitLocker volume encryption, improved CSV performance, SMB 3.0 file share support, support for multiple subnets, support for REFS formatted volumes, data deduplication, and support for tiered and parity storage spaces. Now, we can optimize cluster storage, and it's considerations that we need to keep in mind when configuring the cluster for the CSV access. We're going to use multiple cluster networks to access CSV traffic, disable cluster network communication on cluster networks that carry CSV traffic, make sure the client for Microsoft Networks and file and printer sharing for Microsoft Networks are enabled on the adapters that carry cluster communication, configure minimum bandwidth policy, and QoS priority policy. To configure the server role to use failover clustering, right-click Roles in the left pane of the Failover Cluster Manager. Click Configure Role to start the High Availability Wizard. Before you run High Availability Wizard, you need to install the role or feature on each server in the cluster. And here we are. This is configuring the cluster role. And then we've got Cluster Aware Updating. Now, Cluster Aware Updating, or CAU, automates software updating on cluster servers and maintains cluster service availability. To enable CAU, right-click the cluster in Failover Cluster Manager, click More Actions, and then click Cluster Aware Updating. And here it is. Configure cluster self-updating options. And there we go. So network load balancing uses server clusters to provide scalability and fault tolerance. NLB is a feature available in Windows Server 2016 Data Center and Standard Editions. Failover clusters provide fault tolerance and high availability. The first requirement for a Windows Server 2016 failover cluster is that all cluster servers must have Windows Server 2016 Standard or Data Center Edition installed. Now, the failover cluster function on Windows Server 2016 is installed as a feature in Server Manager or using PowerShell. Fast and fault tolerance access to cluster storage is critical to overall cluster performance. Cluster-aware updating is a new feature in Windows Server 2012 that allows updating failover cluster nodes with Windows updates and maintaining high availability. So there we go with Chapter 8, and we're on to Chapter 9.